Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome back to Big Data Days, Track 2. I am your host here, John, and today we are very fortunate to have Henry, who is a data professional, who is going to talk a little bit more on this big data on hybrid cloud. I'm intrigued. So, Henry, over to you. Can you just take us through what this topic is all about?
Definitely. Thank you, John. Yes, essentially, businesses have been adopting the cloud strategies, and they've been evolving ever since the cloud has hit the enterprises the last 5 years. So the idea is, how can they leverage the current enterprise information that they have in their systems and transfer it over to the cloud? And my overview would be, how can uh, organizations leverage this technology and transfer it to the cloud? What are the processes that takes into account in order for it to move over to the cloud? And one of the overviews is, how can we leverage that technology, and how can we store it into a data lake or storage? And what does that look like for the overview of big data? So I've been working in enterprise data management for the past 10 years. So I've been involved in implementation, working with data, loading data into on-prem services, and being able to leverage that information, query the data using SQL Server or SSIS or things of that nature. But now that the cloud has been introduced in the past 10 years, now organizations wants to move over to a subscription model, where essentially they want to scale their data, pay a price that doesn't involve over investing on hardware, or spinning up data centers or creating new processes. So these two topics that come to mind is public and private clouds. Private clouds is essentially a investment that the organization has made in order for them to house their data. It could be big data centers. It could be essentially investing in a secure location where the organization has total full control of that system. And for public cloud, it's essentially another method of where organizations can subscribe or put their data in a third party location. So a good example would be AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. And essentially, they have responsibility of the data and to protect their data once they move it to the cloud. However, they'll be sharing space with other organizations within that region. So having that opportunity to move that data into the public gives them many opportunities to use third-party tools to query data, to store data, to load data into a process that can be scalable and can be reliable for them. But the risk is they will be responsible for securing the data. And on top of that, they will work with their vendors that they are locked in with to protect their data. So the big data overview, essentially, organizations have been using or loading data from different sources, social media to IoTs, into their systems. But how would they be able to essentially move that data over, or how can they move large amount of data? So there's two frameworks called Spark and Hadoop. Since the beginning, when I started working, they've been adopting locations or on-prem services to how can we extract data and be able to query the information without issues of overloading or not be able to extract the data. So this we'll talk about is the 5 V's of big data, which is how can what are the what does the hybrid cloud architecture look like? But before that, let me talk about the 4 V's, which is volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. So the volume is the huge amount of data that Could be terabytes, petabytes, or exabytes. So this is the amount that organizations might have in their systems. And the velocity is how can data come from different locations and be loaded into their fixed locations. And then we have variety, which is the semi-structure or structure or data type structure that they receive when they work with different vendors or different locations to extract the information. And a good example would be JSON or Excel, or it could be CSV files. So all that is stored into a database. And then we have the veracity, which is when those data is stored within these different locations. Are they reliable? Is it consistent? And does it have, can it be validated? And does it have data checks in order for them to be used for analysis for the data scientist or the data analyst? So the hybrid cloud model is a combination of public and private. So how can the organization move data for the private cloud investments they made over to the public cloud? So they use certain tools to enable workloads to move easily. So since organization has invested in Hadoop and Spark, the cloud has been able to adopt these tools in order for them to match a one-to-one location where they can transfer the private information over to the cloud. A good example is Glue. Be able to use that workload to use, but behind the hood of Glue, it uses AWS tool to run a Spark job to be able to extract data from different locations. Because essentially the way that the on-prem services was adopted, they would use Hadoop and Spark in order for them to move large amounts of data and load it into intermediary. And from there, using the tools from a cloud provider like AWS, they can move data that could be in files or it could be in JSON format. The reality is they need to be able to access that information and store it into a S3 bucket or an Azure blob storage or a Google storage. And to provide an additional context, the organization can continue to use the private cloud alongside the public through virtual private networks and dedicated network systems. So what that means is they need to build a system that is aligned with the same server, same information. So once the data is extracted from the private cloud and loaded into intermediary, it can be loaded into the S3 environment or a Google storage environment or block storage environment. And in order for them to be protected, they must have a firewall that protects the information that can be that needs to be addressed, because that's what the organization invested in using the private cloud. A good example is Meta was slapped with a fine of 1.3 billion over data privacy because they had different data sets located in different locations. And one would be one in the US, it could be one in Europe, or it could be different regions. So in order for the private cloud to work, it has to be set up at a location that is appropriate, follows regulations, and is compliant within different regions in order for them to use the hybrid cloud architecture. Using the hybrid cloud architecture, you'll be able to work with data that's dedicated to its region, sources, and be able to extract information. And here's a good example of a hybrid cloud architecture. So as you see here, private cloud, the company A invests their resources into the company's private cloud. And for a public cloud, there's so many companies that essentially moves data from different locations into the cloud. And at a multi-tenant level, they have access to their own accounts, be able to load S3 buckets or Azure Blob or Google Cloud Storage, and they have access to it. And the public cloud or the vendors or the subscription service, they're responsible to protect and provide those services in order for the company to be able to rely on those services. The complete contrast where company A's private cloud, essentially they need to invest in their infrastructure, invest in their data centers, and invest in providing more compute information in order for them to move data into a private location. So the challenges and opportunities with big data. So with the challenges comes with processing large amounts of data, and organizations use Spark and Hadoop to address these challenges. However, when the integration of this data, it comes with different formats, so they need to be transformed before they're loaded into an intermediary or into a file or into whatever comes out of from a on-prem services or private cloud information. They need to able to extract the information and be able to transform it, and then before they can be loaded into the cloud. And another challenge is data quality. When the data is extracted from a private location like the private cloud, is the information correct? Is it not corrupt? Does the information provide is protected by the systems that was safeguarded at the beginning of the cycle? And does it follow the regulations like GDPR or any other regulations that they're situated in? So once they are able to solve for that, when they move the data into the private cloud to the public cloud, they need to address these challenges. And in order for them to do that, they need to form teams and processes to test these environments. So if they're moving data from private to cloud, they need to create a test environment to create dummy data, provide the transformations, load it into the intermediary, and load it into the S3 bucket or into a public bucket. And what we are going to address is data governance and ethics. When the data is moved, who has the responsibility of using that data? Are they the right actors? Are they the right users to be able to manage and move and transfer the data during this implementation stage? We will find out. But essentially, when working with data, they need to have proper access and accountability when they're using this information and how it is logged and stored into this storage system. So the data is extracted from on-prem, and the universal framework is, be able to use Spark and Hadoop to enable that job. So it benefits them by creating a process that doesn't have to be replicated anymore because they already have it. So all they have to do is create a process to extract the data and load it into storage location or a protected server in order for them to utilize what they have invested in the private cloud. So the costs are low, and the technologies are invested within the organization to be able to do that. So all they have to do is just set up the location where the files will be stored and point to the location where the cloud can be extracted and loaded into a private location. So in order for that to happen, they need to create pipelines and processes in order to move from point A to point C. And how they do that, they would have to use CI/CD pipeline and provide retention policies in order for them to be in compliance with the policies and regulations that they are set. And they must be protected and analyzed. And in order for that to happen, they need to work with different teams, like a cybersecurity or cyber team, in order for them to analyze their pipeline. How is the data coming in from a private location to a public location? Has it been tested? Has it been evaluated by a cybersecurity team? What is being revealed once the data is loaded into a intermediary stage and then loaded into an S3? What does that look like? Have we tested it before? So organizations must invest in having teams develop the process, as well as work in conjunction with other teams in order for them to evaluate their data pipelines and invest in what CI/CD tools they can use to evaluate what code or what processes is being used in order to avoid bad actors from extracting the data or injecting malicious code or destroying the assets that is being processed during this hybrid cloud implementation. So once the data is loaded into the S3 or a AWS environment or Google Cloud Storage, they are then ready to be loaded into different environments. So we have a data warehouse that can be stored, or it can be loaded into a data lake in order for them to query the data, analyze, and provide feedback on how the data is coming through. So the data lake is a good concept because every organization is using it for them to extract different locations. Let's say a team is implementing data processes from their private cloud for JSON, and then they're also processing another data set that is in CSV, and they'll go into the same bucket location but with different folder structure. So the folder structure should be structured as their specific name and the dates that can be broken down in order for them to locate that information and load it into a data lake. And that is how data lakes is used, because it can be it can house semi-structured or structured data, and it could be queried within a lake by utilizing the tools that the cloud provider provides. And a good example in AWS would be Glue, be able to provide the framework to read the columns or the JSON data and be able to analyze what is being loaded into those storage information. So the reason why organizations are now moving to the cloud is because they can move away from paying additional costs, paying for when traffic organizations load data, they can avoid increasing costs by just paying a subscription service. And they only are able to pay what is being used and not when not being utilized. So now that the company has moved away from that model, every company wants to invest in cloud storage and be able to utilize those sources. But it's easier said than done, because we must organizations must invest in teams in order for them to move that information. Issues can occur. For example, if there's not proper testing done, we could be moving data from a private cloud storage to a public, but the data is not up to par and not up to standard in order for the information to be utilized by the data analysts and data scientists. So it's a rigorous test. Investments must be done to have team members come in, provide standards, be able to create processes, tickets, to provide a plan of what needs to be done when migrating different data sources. What are the challenges? What can be done? What are the blockers? Things of that nature. That data plays a role, because when moving data, there are many outside variables that we cannot take into account. So that those must be analyzed and handled appropriately by the teams in order for them to provide a good processes on the cloud. So for them to be successful, they need to use the software development lifecycle. So they need to document a plan of action, document different processes, what are the steps that needs to be done in order to move private to the AWS cloud, which team is responsible for processes this information, how can we communicate with other teams to reduce the silos so we can resolve any blockers, such as if the data is not being loaded into different locations within the private cloud. How can we get it over to an intermediary? Um, the documentations and the best practices is required because accountability is important, because when working with this types of platform, they needs to be able to understand what's being done, what the steps was there to be completed in order to move to the cloud. Was it done correctly? Did we follow? Were we complying with the request from the users? So all this thing cannot be done without the software development lifecycle and being able to document and reduce risk by just having teams take on an additional load and be able to move forward into this process. So how can we protect the data of users, or how can we protect information that's being transmitted from private to public? So a good strategy could be to house add a layer of protection, and by masking data or by creating an additional process that um, collects the same amount of data, but the data that is sensitive can be masked and can be protected or encrypted before it's transported to the intermediary and then loaded into a AWS environment. And having access to that data, teams must be approved to be on those assignments, be able to log in and use the tools to do their work. Authentication and single sign-on is one way of being able to track and see what is being done or what is being worked on the data when they log in, and be able to see what's being tracked and loaded. When working with encryption data or masking data, the team or the development team must test this process, because when the data is loaded and transmitted to an intermediary up to the S3, they need to see if the data is matching one-to-one from the beginning all the way to the end. And that takes time, because there are issues that we encounter, so like the data could be corrupted. There's encoding issues, meaning that there's a disconnect between how the information can be displayed from different servers. And also the data development team must create different layers of processes. The example was testing, prod, and pre-prod, in order for them to regularly test their process. And this is just one layer of data security that they are able to essentially protect PII. But the second layer would be working with the cybersecurity team to protect the pipeline, what code is being run, what's being implemented, and then the third layer would be just to the overall protection of the server by the platform team. Challenges and future trends. So the challenges that we face is that we might lack skills and expertise in the coming futures when we're trying to move from private or on-prem to the cloud. And a good example is we don't have skills and expertise of people who work on the mainframe or Java, or because now that we're moving to more skills in the cloud, those are become less and less in demand. And we need to have a structured data governance, because we need to verify and validate data coming in from different sources, and that is difficult because you are having different sources coming in like IOTS, social media, banking information. That's a lot of data that requires a lot of attention and build up of a team that should govern that information. So that is still a work in progress. Another challenge is the vendor lock-in. So once the organization invests in, let's say AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, they are locked in with their vendors, so they are able to switch from different providers, and their data is stored into their systems, and they'll be difficult to move or load to different locations. And the data integration and interoperability. How can we leverage the tools to combine different tools that AI or Spark or Hadoop can and integrate? So there's so many tools out there in the market, and we're just scratched the surface of what can be done to move. But as I gave a basic example, we could use Informatica, or we could use Airflow, but at the end of the day, there's so many options to choose from. What would be the appropriate tools to do the job and be able to successfully transfer data from different locations. With the advent of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT coming into the market, it's become important for us or organizations to protect the data, and how can that be leveraged to provide good and proper governance in order for the information that the analysts and data scientists use, be able to make predictions, make good decisions, and provide good services to customers. And as well as data ops has been a growing field that many organizations are leveraging experts to be able to create processes within the cloud and be able to provide support to users that experience issues on the platform or unable to use the data in an appropriate manner. But that is the process that I've seen so far, and I expect that organizations to continue to invest in cloud technologies, because now that it is much easier now to leverage that information at a moment of pace. And thank you very much.
That's a interesting sharing, Henry, on why so-called companies, organizations should look at going to the cloud and taking advantage of that. But we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Allow me to project them. So this is actually asked by anonymously one of our attendees. So he's asking, do public clouds guarantee the same degree of privacy and security as associated to the private cloud? So we are referring to public cloud and private cloud on the degree of privacy and security. What's your thoughts on this one, Henry?
It really depends. So private clouds organizations are investing in their own resources to invest to protect the data. Mm-hmm. As for public clouds, they are restricted to the protections that they have provided by their vendors. So they also have to invest to make sure that what they put into their locations are protected. And a good example would be if I use a storage bucket, make sure I don't make it public. And I also need to create scripts in order to provide checks onto each resources. What company has access to my data, and can I track it within the public cloud location? So it's my responsibility to make sure that my data is protected from a public cloud environment. So yeah, it's more pressure for me or organizations' pressures to protect their data once it's out of their hands. And with private clouds, it's a different story.
Okay. Okay, interesting in that sense. So basically, we still have to protect it, right? Regardless whether it's a public or even a private cloud. If I understand correctly from you, it's just I think the degree of involvement or the tools in terms of the investment that we need to make, right? Am I correct, Henry, in that sense?
Yeah, more investments will be done, like health checks. It could be
Mm,
monitoring, creating a process that logs users accessing, let's say, a tool, accessing a bucket. Those will be tracked and loaded into a environment where security can take a look and see who's looking at this data, who is loading this script, and who has controls over
mm.
these types of environments. So that is more users or more resources to analyze that type of location.
Right. Thanks for that, Henry. There's
Mhm.
another question from Sebastian. Allow me to project that quickly. So Sebastian is asking, are there any laws or regulations that address cloud technology? In that sense, that's the first part. It says that it seems the law regarding the digital world are being continually introduced, but probably has not made its way to cover all technology we talk about. What's your view on this one, Henry?
From my experiences, the development team are not aware, but they follow what is best practices. Let's say if we have data, we cannot remove it from the server. We have to make sure that's situated there. Um, there is regulations that must be followed. For example, if it's a government agency and we're moving data, it needs to be protected. It cannot be shown to the public or anything. So the development team must be instructed, or business or management must provide that information
Right.
for the organization so the development team can work and complete that task. So it comes from the top to the bottom, and they have to be aware. And also they take security training, and
Mm.
they take employee training, so they are invested and aware of are these rules. If not, then yeah, we'll have problems like, you know,
Right.
Facebook having data from different locations,
Mm.
or someone be able to extract the data from the servers into their own private address.
Yeah, that's quite a scary one. The example you raised about Facebook. On a separate front, right? I'm just curious, Henry. I think your presentation you've been actually encouraging actually a lot of companies that have been looking at how do we get to the cloud, and stuff like that, right? To take advantage of the cloud, right? But there is also another school of thoughts. I just want to get your feedback. Is
Sure.
that there are people are also exiting from the cloud. That means they are actually going away from the cloud. I mean, the fact that they've actually used the cloud, they say, hang on, John, I don't think that's right for our so-called business operation or the way we run it. We were actually moving back on-prem. Have you seen any of those trends happening, or what's your thoughts on that one?
Yes, I've heard or I've read about Africa. They're now adopting technologies that the U.S. has been using for the past 10 years, which is Hadoop frameworks and Spark,
Right.
um, because they have a level of control over that data. They can control their security, and they can essentially build their own processes without a third party, being involved in their process. So they're trying to take back control
Hmm.
of their infrastructures. But those are like countries outside of the United States. It could be Africa, or it could be in South America. But essentially, it's just, it's convenient for them, and they want control over it.
Right. So that strategy does make sense, right? Which comes back to my second or follow-up question to that, right? Do you
Mhm.
think companies need to have an exit strategy from the cloud? I mean, the fact that a lot of companies are exploring and say, hey, John, we got to go to the cloud, or we're using a hybrid cloud, for example. In one of my previous companies that I work for, they say, John, we have a dual cloud strategy. So I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? Well, basically they're saying, hey, we have Azure, we have AWS, as two different cloud provider in that sense. So I'm just curious, should we be considering an exit strategy per se?
I don't think so, because essentially the companies has already copies of their data within their, let's say, private cloud, so they can ask the vendors to, purge it, and or once their contract is up, they don't have to use them anymore, and they can move to another provider. It's just the risk is, when I give you my data, in my
Mm,
in my I'm entrusting you to hold it and protect it from uh, bad users or bad actors or
agreed.
just
Yep.
yeah.
So you don't think we need to worry about too much on that, and you see that the future is still on the cloud at this point in time, right?
Uh, uh, I'll say that we're okay with the cloud because now
Right.
that we have ChatGPT, we need something more to support our infrastructure. I don't think companies would want to run a chatbot on a on-prem services, and they will have
Mm.
to invest more on hardware, more on. I don't think that
Yeah, I think
makes.
that's one concern. If you're talking about investing, you want it to be on demand. In that case, right? Cloud is definitely the way to go. Just that I'm like I said, I'm seeing a portion, or should I say, a few of the companies are considering moving back on prem. And people are talking about, hey, should we be looking at an exit strategy from the cloud? That's also, I think, questions that needs to be looked at. But again, like I said, I respect the view that if you think that is better to stay on the cloud. Yep, that could be it. Let's
Well,
take it.
that's my perspective from the U.S.
Right.
But yeah. Yeah.
Okay. No worries. Guys, is there any other questions for Henry? Please put them in the chat. We still have time for perhaps another questions in that sense. All right, I'll just check, Henry. I think we are good at this point in time. Again, thank you so much, Henry, for sharing with us your thoughts on this hybrid cloud. I think that's very interesting. I think that's something that companies should take advantage of. Like you said, there are lots of benefits in doing so. Again, we thank you, Henry, for joining us for today's session. Right, for those of you who are hanging around, please do join us on the last leg of the presentation. We do have the closing and award ceremony coming up at the hour as being shown. So we hope to see you shortly at the closing and award ceremony. All right, guys, have a great day ahead and have a good evening as well if your time zones is actually at the evening. All right, we'll see you in the next session. Thank you so much.